When a child falls ill, parents want what we all want: absolute safety, a steady hand, and the reassurance of a white uniform. You hand over your baby, trusting that the people inside the hospital are there to heal. Families found comfort in a young, dedicated pediatric nurse. She was always the first to reach the crib when the heart monitors screamed. She was attentive, compassionate, and seemingly perfect. She was also a predator hunting in a children's ward. She was not rushing to save their lives. She was the one stopping their hearts. Nobody told the parents. Grantham and Kesteven Hospital sat quietly in the heart of Lincolnshire, England. It was not a sprawling, faceless medical complex in a massive urban center. It was a modest, local community hospital, deeply woven into the fabric of the surrounding towns. For the families living in the area, it represented the ultimate safety net. It was the kind of place where generations of the same families had been treated, where neighbors often worked alongside neighbors. If your child suffered a severe asthma attack in the middle of the night, or developed a sudden, frightening fever, this was exactly where you brought them. You drove through the quiet English streets, carried your child through the automatic doors, and surrendered total control to the professionals inside. For these local families, Ward 4, the Children's Medical and Surgical Wing, was a sanctuary. It was a place defined by the soft hum of monitors, the sterile smell of antiseptic, and the reassuring presence of medical experts. You trusted the institution implicitly. In the early months of 1991, the anxious parents walking through the double doors of Ward 4 were frequently greeted by a 22-year-old state-enrolled nurse named Beverley Allitt. She looked the part perfectly. She wore the crisp uniform with an air of absolute authority and projected an image of boundless, youthful enthusiasm. To the exhausted mothers and terrified fathers sitting rigidly beside metal hospital cribs, Allitt quickly appeared to be nothing short of a guardian angel. She was highly visible on the ward, always hovering nearby, ready to offer a warm smile or a comforting hand, resting gently on a trembling shoulder. When a sick baby cried out in the agonizing hours of the early morning, she was consistently the very first staff member to arrive at the bedside. When a mother wept from sheer exhaustion and fear, Allitt was there, providing quiet words of reassurance and seemingly endless empathy. She deliberately cultivated deep, emotionally charged bonds with the families of the sickest children. She did not just check charts and administer standard medication. She embedded herself into their temporary, terrifying hospital lives. She made them feel seen, supported, and safe. They viewed her as a fiercely dedicated professional who was personally invested in the survival and swift recovery of their little ones. Grateful parents thanked her profusely. They trusted her completely. They had absolutely no reason to suspect that her apparent dedication was a carefully constructed illusion. But the administration at Grantham Hospital knew there was another, far less reassuring side to Beverley Allitt. The official paper trail she left behind before ever stepping onto the pediatric ward told a completely different story. During her nursing training, she was the exact opposite of the star pupil she pretended to be. She carried a documented, highly troubling history of erratic behavior and chronic absences. She called in sick with an alarming frequency, stringing together an endless sequence of vague, unprovable physical ailments to avoid her training duties. Her supervisors had noted her bizarre tendency to seek medical attention for herself rather than focusing on patient care. Beyond her mysterious, constant illnesses, her academic record was catastrophic. She had repeatedly failed critical nursing examinations. She demonstrated a persistent inability to grasp essential medical protocols. By all standard medical metrics, she was entirely unfit to hold the fragile lives of vulnerable infants in her hands. The red flags were glaring, documented, and officially filed away in her personnel record. A competent, fully staffed medical facility would have rejected her application without a second thought. But Grantham and Kesteven Hospital was facing a quiet crisis of its own. In early 1991, they were suffering from a severe, crippling shortage of qualified medical staff. The pediatric ward was desperately under-resourced and struggling to maintain basic operations. Management needed bodies on the floor to keep the ward functional. They needed someone, anyone, to wear the uniform, walk the halls, and monitor the beds. Driven by administrative desperation, they ignored her academic failures. They overlooked her highly suspicious medical history and the clear warnings from her training supervisors. Instead of turning her away, they offered Beverley Allitt a short-term, temporary contract to quickly fill a gaping hole in their staff roster. The hospital desperately needed a caregiver. They unknowingly hired a predator. In the final days of February 1991, a 7-week-old boy named Liam Taylor was carried through the doors of Ward 4. He was suffering from a minor chest infection. It was the kind of routine, seasonal illness that brought a steady stream of infants into the hospital, frightening for the parents, but entirely manageable for the medical professionals. The doctors examined him, administered standard treatments, and offered reassuring words to his mother and father. Liam was stable. He was responding well to the care. His parents sat by his metal crib, finally breathing a sigh of relief. They fully expected to pack up his tiny belongings and take him back to the safety of his own nursery within a few short days. On the 23rd of February, that timeline was violently destroyed. Liam's condition deteriorated with impossible, terrifying speed. He suffered a sudden, completely inexplicable respiratory arrest. His tiny lungs simply stopped drawing in air. The monitoring machinery attached to his fragile body began to scream, shattering the quiet routine of the pediatric ward. The person who claimed to have found him in this critical state was Beverley Allitt. She was the one who sprinted into the hallway. She was the one who raised the emergency alarm, calling urgently for the resuscitation team to save the child. The ensuing scene was one of concentrated chaos. Doctors and senior nurses rushed into the small room, shoving aside chairs and medical trays to reach the crib. The emergency crash cart was ripped open. The controlled, sterile environment instantly dissolved into a desperate battleground. Medical staff performed aggressive CPR on the 7-week-old infant. They forced oxygen into his failing lungs. They pumped his chest. The sheer panic in the room was palpable as highly experienced pediatricians fought blindly to restart a heart that had stopped without any logical medical reason. Throughout the entire agonizing ordeal, Allitt remained close by, watching the frantic, desperate efforts of the medical team she had summoned. The doctors eventually managed to get his heart beating again, but the medical victory was agonizingly brief. The prolonged lack of oxygen had already caused catastrophic, irreversible brain damage. Liam survived the initial collapse, only to be tethered to life support machines, his small body slowly shutting down. Days later, his parents were led into a quiet room and handed the heaviest burden any mother or father could ever bear. They had to make the excruciating decision to turn off the machines, keeping their son alive. Liam Taylor passed away. His mother and father were entirely shattered. Their entire world had collapsed in a matter of hours. In the absolute depths of their unimaginable grief, they looked desperately for a source of comfort. They found it in the young, attentive nurse who had been holding vigil at his bedside. Through their tears, they actually thanked Beverley Allitt. They thanked her for her perceived vigilance. They thanked her for sounding the alarm so quickly, for holding their hands in the aftermath, and for trying so desperately to save their baby boy. They had absolutely no idea they were thanking his executioner. The senior medical staff was deeply baffled. Initial reviews of the charts yielded no clear answers. They could find no underlying pathology or structural defect to explain why a minor respiratory bug had suddenly escalated into a fatal cardiac arrest. Ultimately, lacking any other logical explanation, they filed the paperwork. Doctors marked Liam's death as a tragic medical anomaly, but it was just the first day of a 59-day nightmare. The death of Liam Taylor was not an isolated tragedy. It was a catalyst. Almost immediately after his passing, Ward 4 descended into a state of relentless, terrifying chaos. The piercing shrill of heart monitors, flatlining, became a sickeningly regular soundtrack. Infants and toddlers who had been admitted for routine observations or minor viral infections were suddenly crashing. Healthy pink skin turned cyanotic in a matter of minutes. Breathing stopped. Tiny hearts seized. The sheer volume of these emergencies defied all medical logic. Over a span of just 59 days, the pediatric wing transformed into a ground zero of inexplicable trauma. The grim toll was statistically impossible for a quiet community hospital. 4 young children were dead. 9 others had suffered grievous bodily harm, narrowly surviving respiratory and cardiac arrests, but often left with severe, life-altering injuries. It was an absolute massacre, and it was happening right in front of the doctors. There was no airborne virus. There was no widespread hospital infection. The weapon was a standard medical syringe, wielded by Beverley Allitt. Her methods were brutally clinical. She routinely drew up massive, lethal doses of insulin and injected them into the infants, forcing their blood sugar to crash into profound, uncontrollable hypoglycemia. In other cases, she bypassed insulin entirely and injected potassium directly into their fragile veins. Potassium is a chemical that immediately disrupts the electrical signals of the heart, causing instantaneous and violent cardiac arrest. When she chose not to use chemicals, she simply injected large air bubbles into their bloodstream. The resulting air embolism would travel through the tiny veins and fatally block blood flow to the heart or brain. The terrifying brilliance of her crimes lay in her choice of weapons. Insulin and potassium are naturally occurring substances within the human body. When an infant suffers a severe medical collapse, their physical system undergoes massive biochemical stress. In the frantic aftermath of a cardiac arrest, abnormal potassium or glucose levels are almost always interpreted as the tragic physical consequences of the body shutting down, rather than the external cause of the collapse itself. These substances leave no obvious physical wounds. Routine post-mortem examinations do not actively search for deliberate insulin overdoses. To uncover the truth, pathologists would have to request highly specific forensic toxicology screenings, but they had absolutely no reason to order them. They were looking for a rare disease. They were looking for a hidden genetic flaw. The medical staff was running out of explanations. The invisible killer was hiding in plain sight, holding the syringe. By late April 1991, the administration at Grantham and Kesteven Hospital could no longer hide behind the comforting illusion of tragic coincidences. The statistical anomaly had morphed into an undeniable, terrifying pattern. A small-town pediatric ward simply does not experience this catastrophic volume of sudden deaths and near-fatal emergencies without a central external cause. The terrifying suspicion finally took root. A serial killer was actively operating within their own walls. Hospital executives bypassed standard internal reviews. They contacted the police and brought in independent medical consultants to audit the entire facility. The pediatric ward was quietly turned into a crime scene. Detectives and outside medical experts began dissecting the chaotic events of the previous 2 months. They stripped away the complex medical jargon and focused on a single, fundamental piece of logistical data. They demanded the nursing duty rosters. Investigators systematically mapped out the exact times of all the sudden respiratory arrests, the violent hypoglycemic episodes, and the fatal cardiac failures. Then they overlaid the staff attendance records for Ward 4. The turning point of the investigation did not reveal a complex web of suspects. It revealed a single, devastating straight line. Beverley Allitt was the only staff member present on the ward during every single collapse. When she was on shift, children crashed. When she went home, the ward was peaceful. But presence alone does not equate to murder in a court of law. Detectives had circumstantial evidence, but they desperately needed physical, undeniable proof. The definitive breakthrough came from the laboratory. Medical consultants ordered highly specific forensic toxicology tests on the preserved blood samples of a surviving victim, a baby who had inexplicably collapsed and been successfully revived. The laboratory results were staggering. The child's blood contained astronomically high levels of insulin. The baby was not diabetic. There was absolutely no legitimate medical reason for insulin to be present in the child's treatment plan. Furthermore, the human body does not spontaneously generate the hormone in such massive, lethal quantities. The forensic conclusion was absolute. The insulin had been deliberately and maliciously injected by someone holding a syringe, armed with a definitive murder weapon. Investigators moved to seize the final piece of the puzzle. They returned to Ward 4 to confiscate the daily nursing logs. They specifically needed the detailed clinical notes Allitt was required by law to maintain on her patients. Detectives intended to trace her exact movements and documented interactions with the infants in the minutes right before they crashed. But when investigators opened the filing cabinets, the records were gone. Allitt's specific nursing logs for the targeted victims had mysteriously disappeared from the secure ward. The pages detailing her time with the deceased and injured infants had been physically removed. She had deliberately erased her paper trail. The missing documents spoke louder than any written confession. The doctors finally understood exactly what had been happening to their patients. The medical mystery was finally solved, but it birthed a horrifying criminal reality. In November 1991, Nottinghamshire police finally made their move. They did not raid a criminal hideout or apprehend a visibly violent offender. They simply walked in and arrested a quiet, seemingly ordinary 23-year-old woman. Beverley Allitt was taken into custody and placed inside a stark, windowless interrogation room. She was stripped of the crisp nursing uniform that had provided her with a perfect, impenetrable shield for months. Detectives sat across a metal table from a young woman who looked entirely unremarkable. She possessed no defining physical traits that suggested a capacity for immense evil. She still looked exactly like the soft-spoken caregiver who had held the hands of weeping mothers. But the seasoned investigators sitting opposite her knew the staggering weight of the forensic evidence. They were fully prepared to confront a highly manipulative and prolific serial killer, to comprehend the absolute horror unleashed upon Ward 4. Medical experts had to carefully dissect the mind of the accused. Forensic psychiatrists evaluated her extensively, searching for any logical explanation for the systematic slaughter of innocent infants. The official medical diagnosis they reached was chillingly precise. Beverley Allitt was suffering from factitious disorder imposed on another, a severe psychiatric condition formerly known as Munchausen syndrome by proxy. This is a complex, insidious, and highly destructive mental health disorder. It occurs when a caregiver deliberately causes acute physical harm or entirely fabricates a deadly illness in a highly vulnerable dependent. The victims are almost exclusively young children or infants who cannot speak for themselves. In the mind of the afflicted caregiver, these children are not human beings deserving of protection. They are reduced to mere instruments, utilized solely to serve a deeply disturbed psychological need. The underlying motive for the murders completely defied standard criminal logic. Allitt did not poison these infants out of deep-seated malice or hatred. She did not target these specific local families to exact any kind of personal revenge. There was absolutely no financial gain or tangible reward involved in the deaths. The actual reality of her motivation was far more twisted and terrifying. She deliberately orchestrated massive, life-or-death medical emergency purely to force herself into the center of absolute attention. When a baby's heart suddenly stopped, the entire pediatric ward immediately revolved around her actions. She intensely craved the sudden rush of adrenaline that accompanied a desperate resuscitation effort. More importantly, she fed off the profound sympathy of her exhausted medical colleagues and the tearful gratitude of the terrified parents. She was completely addicted to the intoxicating feeling of being the indispensable, heroic nurse standing bravely on the front lines of a devastating medical crisis. During countless hours of intense police interrogation, the carefully constructed facade finally fell away, and her true nature fully surfaced. She exhibited a complete, terrifying lack of human remorse. Detectives presented her with the undeniable laboratory data concerning the lethal insulin levels. They questioned her relentlessly about the conveniently missing nursing logs and her solitary presence during every single collapse. She did not break down under the immense pressure. She did not offer a tearful confession, nor did she ever beg for forgiveness from the families she had destroyed. Instead, she remained entirely detached. She offered cold, flat denials with a chilling emotional emptiness that unsettled even the most experienced detectives. She viewed the dead and permanently brain-damaged children not as victims, but as necessary props in her own elaborate personal drama. She didn't just want to be a murderer. She wanted to be the star of a tragedy. In early 1993, the trial of Beverley Allitt commenced at Nottingham Crown Court. The prosecution faced a highly complex task. There were no eyewitnesses to the fatal injections. There was no security footage capturing the crimes. The entire case rested on a dense, highly technical web of circumstantial and forensic medical evidence. But the prosecution built an absolutely flawless timeline. They presented the toxicological reports detailing the lethal insulin spikes, highlighted the conveniently erased nursing logs, and pointed to the undeniable statistical impossibility of her presence at every single collapse. The jury saw straight through the blank, emotionless stare of the defendant. In May 1993, Beverley Allitt was found guilty of 4 counts of murder, 3 counts of attempted murder, and 6 counts of causing grievous bodily harm. The judge handed down 13 life sentences, ensuring she would never again walk the halls of any hospital. The trial was officially over. The killer was legally contained. But the anger of the grieving families was just about to find a new institutional target. The courtroom conviction answered who committed the crimes. It did not answer how she was allowed to commit them in the first place. That horrifying answer arrived the following year with the publication of the Clothier Report, an independent official inquiry into the disaster at Grantham and Kesteven Hospital. The report dropped a bombshell on the medical establishment and the parents who had already lost everything. Beverley Allitt was a monster, but the report proved she was a monster operating within a system suffering from catastrophic institutional failure. The inquiry laid bare the hospital's deeply negligent hiring practices. Administrators had full access to Allitt's disastrous training records. They knew she had repeatedly failed her critical nursing examinations. They held the files documenting her bizarre, chronic absenteeism and her history of seeking unnecessary medical attention for herself. Nursing instructors had raised glaring red flags about her fundamental unsuitability for the medical profession. Yet, the hospital was facing a severe, crippling staffing shortage. Ward 4 was dangerously under-resourced. Management made a calculated administrative decision to prioritize filling a schedule vacancy over thoroughly vetting the applicant. They needed a warm body on the floor to keep the pediatric wing operational. They ignored the documented warnings. They handed a ward full of sick infants over to an unqualified deeply disturbed individual, simply because they needed another person in uniform to cover the shifts. For the parents of the victims, this revelation was an entirely new kind of betrayal. The unimaginable grief of burying a child was now compounded by the sickening realization that the deaths were entirely preventable. They had trusted the hospital with their most precious loved ones. They believed the institution had rigorous safeguards in place to weed out the incompetent and the dangerous. Instead, they discovered that the administration had effectively played Russian roulette with the lives of infants to solve a temporary scheduling problem. Beverley Allitt was removed from society, imprisoned behind high security walls. The legal proceedings had done their job. The justice system finally locked her away, but it was the medical system that had handed her the syringe. The true cost of those 59 days is not merely measured in the 4 infant lives that were deliberately stolen. It is measured in the silent, enduring agony of the survivors. Several of the children who were successfully resuscitated on Ward 4 did not walk away unscathed. Stripped of oxygen during their manufactured cardiac arrests, they were left with severe, permanent brain damage. They were condemned to a lifetime of complex medical dependencies. Their parents carry a profound, lifelong trauma that no court verdict or institutional apology can ever erase. They brought their sick babies to a trusted local sanctuary for healing, and they walked out with shattered realities. Today, Beverley Allitt remains locked away. She does not sit in a standard prison cell. She is held indefinitely under maximum security at Rampton Secure Hospital. In the 3 decades since her conviction, she has never offered a genuine explanation. She has never provided a single fragment of closure to the families she systematically destroyed. She took the complete, unspoken truth of her darkest psychological impulses into the sterile silence of a psychiatric ward. She intends to keep it there. Her crimes represent the ultimate, unthinkable betrayal of the medical profession. The white clinical coat is universally understood as a symbol of absolute safety. It is a silent promise of protection when we are at our most vulnerable. Beverley Allitt weaponized that promise. She seamlessly turned the tools of modern medicine into instruments of death, hiding a predator's instinct behind a caregiver's smile. Thank you for listening. Drop your feedback below, and I hope to see you again right here on my channel.